There's no doubt that the Vatican has an enormous amount of secrets.
What secrets does the Vatican really have? In recent decades, it's been rocked by scandal after scandal. The Vatican Bank, child abuse, and more recently, serious accusations.
There are persistent rumors about close links between the Vatican Bank and the mafia.
You can find actual documents that show that members of the Vatican helped Nazis escape.
There's been no doubt that the Vatican, despite promoting kindness to all men and Christianity, also has its dark side.
Nobody knows how much money the church has got, least of all the church.
Corruption and paedophilia has left such a mark on the credibility of the church. I think the Vatican Bank could actually bring down the Catholic Church.
The bells of St. Peter's Basilica have fallen silent. The world stands still as news spreads across continents.
Breaking news. The Vatican has announced the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88.
Pope Francis has passed away at 88 years old. But beneath the solemn masses and public mourning lies a web of secrets and scandals that the Vatican has desperately tried to keep buried. What final warnings did Francis leave for the world? What sins of the Church did he take to his grave? And what happens now in this sacred power vacuum? Easter Sunday 2025 marked the final public appearance of the man born Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Struggling to breathe, confined to a wheelchair yet refusing oxygen assistance, he insisted on delivering that last blessing to the faithful. None of the 50,000 gathered in St. Peter's Square realized they were witnessing his final farewell. Within hours, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The bilateral pneumonia that had plagued him for weeks finally overcame him, and at 7:35 a.m. on April 21st, Pope Francis drew his last breath at Casa Santa Marta, the modest Vatican guest house he chose over the opulent papal apartments. The Camerlengo, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell, performed the ancient ritual, calling the Pope's baptismal name 3 times, confirming no response, and then pronouncing to the College of Cardinals, "Vera mortuus est." The Pope is truly dead. The fisherman's ring was removed from Francis's finger, soon to be scratched with a special tool as centuries of tradition dictate, symbolizing the end of his pontificate. His apartments were sealed with wax, his personal papers secured. Francis had long prepared for this moment, determined to break from tradition even in death. He rejected the pomp typically surrounding papal funerals, no elaborate catafalque, no exclusive wake for church officials, opting instead for a simple wooden coffin open to the public in St. Peter's Basilica. Dignified but sober, he had instructed, like that of any Christian. And in his final departure from custom, he chose not to be buried in the Vatican grottos like his predecessors, but in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, a Roman church to which he held deep devotion. There he often prayed before the icon of Salus Populi Romani before and after every international journey, a personal ritual that reflected both his spiritual humility and his role as Bishop of Rome, which he held in equal weight with his global mission. For 12 years, Pope Francis had steered the Catholic Church through turbulent waters. The first pontiff from the Americas, the first Jesuit to occupy the chair of St. Peter, and the first to take the name of Francis, honoring the 12th century saint who abandoned family wealth to serve the poor. From the moment he greeted the crowd with a humble bow on March 13, 2013, Francis signaled a departure from Vatican extravagance. He chose to live in a Vatican guest house instead of the lavish papal apartments, carried his own briefcase, paid his own bills, and rode in modest cars. He embraced people with severe disfigurements, washed the feet of prisoners and Muslim women on Holy Thursday, and even slipped out of the Vatican at night to give money to the homeless. Acts that consistently reminded the Church of its duty to the marginalized and reflected a vision of servant leadership that resonated far beyond the Catholic world. But his pontificate was defined as much by controversy as compassion. He challenged the idolatry of money and global economic inequality. He championed environmental protection and migrant rights when populist sentiment pushed against both. He attempted to reform Vatican finances, streamline bureaucracy, and address the sexual abuse scandals that have hemorrhaged the Church's moral authority. Yet many conservatives within the church viewed his reforms as dangerous deviations from doctrine, while progressives often felt he didn't go far enough. Now, as the 9-day mourning period known as Novendials begins, a potent question emerges. What secrets will Francis take to his grave? What scandals remain unrevealed? And what happens next in a church at the crossroads? The divisions within Catholicism have only deepened during Francis's tenure. Conservative factions hope for a return to tradition, to doctrinal certainty, perhaps even a pope who will undo some of Francis's reforms. Progressive elements pray for someone who will accelerate changes regarding women's roles, LGBTQ acceptance, and power sharing with the laity. The cardinals walking into that conclave carry not just their own convictions, but the weight of a church at a crossroads. And looming over all of it, the unresolved scandals that have shaken the foundations of faith worldwide. The most devastating remains the sexual abuse crisis. For decades, predator priests were shuttled from parish to parish, diocese to diocese, even country to country, while victims' voices were silenced. Francis inherited this catastrophe and made steps toward accountability, apologizing to victims, meeting with survivors, accepting the resignations of implicated bishops, and revising church law to facilitate investigations. Yet critics argue his actions remained insufficient, often more symbolic than substantive. Consider the case of Father Javier Rivoire, a French priest accused of sexually abusing 4 Inuit children, including 14-year-old Marius Tungilik, in northern Canada during the 1980s. When allegations surfaced, Rivoire was whisked back to France, evading Canadian authorities for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, Marius, haunted by trauma, struggled with addiction and mental health challenges before ultimately taking his own life in 2012. His sister Therese described how her brother could not sleep in the dark and was still afraid even as an adult, the psychological wounds never healing. The priest lived freely among his religious community in Strasbourg, moving between priories whenever scrutiny approached. When confronted by journalists, he played dumb. "Have you ever sexually assaulted children?" they asked. His telling response, "I don't know, because you are not my confessor." Or take Father Emmanuel, from the controversial community of St. John, accused of abusing multiple boys in Cameroon. When local authorities became involved, the Archbishop stepped in, writing to the community's leadership. The brothers in question were about to be hauled in front of the courts, at a risk of dirtying the image of our church. I used all my weight to make sure this did not happen. The solution? Ship Father Emmanuel to Bologna, Italy, where, despite claims he would have no contact with children, he was posted to a priory that hosted children's theater programs. These cases represent just the visible portion of a sprawling infrastructure of concealment. Patrick Wall, a former American priest turned whistleblower, described what he calls the geographic solution. When a bishop finds out that a priest is a perpetrator, he simply moves him to a different spot where the previous scandal is not known. And if that's not enough, you move him outside the country. An investigation identified 95 such international transfers since 1990 alone, involving priests who had allegedly abused over 800 victims. Francis had promised accountability, but the system of secrecy persisted during his pontificate. Even within his inner circle, the Council of Cardinals that advised him on church governance sat men accused of covering up abuse. Cardinal George Pell of Australia, who admitted knowing about abusive priests but failing to report them to authorities. Cardinal Francisco Errázuriz of Chile, who waited 5 years after victims came forward before removing Father Caradima, later found guilty of serial abuse. And darkest of all, Francis himself faced allegations of complicity before becoming pope. When he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, victims of abuse claimed he ignored their pleas for help. In the case of Father Julio Cesar Grassi, a prominent priest convicted of molesting orphans and sentenced to 15 years in prison, evidence suggests then Cardinal Bergoglio commissioned a 2,800-page counter-inquiry questioning the victim's credibility and attempting to influence appellate judges. One judge described receiving the document as a subtle pressure on the judges, though it ultimately failed to overturn Grassi's conviction. So as we witness the pomp of a papal funeral and the drama of conclave, we must ask, what other secrets departed with Francis? What files remain sealed? What victims unheard? What perpetrators protected? And will his successor continue incremental reforms or truly confront the Church's darkest shadows? His reign was also marked by unprecedented diplomatic efforts. He helped broker the historic thaw between the United States and Cuba before visiting the communist country in 2015. He fearlessly traveled to conflict zones, Iraq, Central African Republic, South Sudan, bringing messages of reconciliation. He knelt to kiss the feet of South Sudanese leaders, begging them to maintain their fragile peace accord. At the Hypocenter Park in Nagasaki, Japan, he stood where atomic bombs had caused unprecedented destruction and declared, "The use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, just as the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral." Francis reimagined the papacy as a platform for global moral leadership beyond Catholic concerns. He condemned the arms trade, describing weapons money as drenched in blood, often innocent blood. He elevated climate change as a defining moral issue, publishing his encyclical Laudato Si, calling for an ecological conversion and launching initiatives for Catholic institutions to become environmentally sustainable. And in a church historically dominated by European power, he shifted focus to the peripheries, elevating cardinals from Myanmar, Mali, Laos, and other regions traditionally underrepresented in Vatican leadership. Yet for all this global vision, Francis struggled to manage the Vatican itself. The promised reforms of the Roman Curia, the central administrative body of the Catholic Church, proceeded in fits and starts. Financial scandals continued to emerge, including questionable real estate investments involving hundreds of millions of euros from collections meant for the poor. Power struggles between traditionalists and reformers played out in leaks to the press, anonymous accusations, and bureaucratic foot-dragging. Perhaps most consequential was Francis's attempt to change the Church's approach to divorced Catholics, cohabitating couples, and LGBTQ individuals. His 2016 apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, suggested a more flexible, case-by-case approach to communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, igniting fierce resistance from traditionalists who saw it as undermining doctrinal certainty. In December 2023, he authorized priests to bless same-sex couples while maintaining official opposition to gay marriage, further fracturing a church already divided on issues of sexuality and gender. Now, with the chair of St. Peter vacant, these tensions will shape the selection of the next pope. Will the cardinals choose someone to continue Francis's vision of a field hospital church focused on mercy rather than doctrinal rigidity? Or will they turn to a figure promising stability and tradition after a pontificate marked by constant controversy? History offers intriguing parallels. When Pope John XXIII died in 1963, after launching the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, cardinals selected Paul VI, who continued the council while moderating some initiatives. After the brief 33-day pontificate of John Paul I in 1978, they chose Karol Wojtyla as John Paul II, beginning a 27-year papacy that emphasized doctrinal clarity and global evangelization. When Benedict XVI, formerly Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, doctrinal enforcer under John Paul II, resigned in 2013, the cardinals pivoted to Bergoglio, a pastoral figure from the global south with a different emphasis. The spiritual foundation of papal authority stretches back to Jesus' words to Simon Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." This designation of Peter as the rock, complete with a name change signifying his new essence, established the basis for apostolic succession, the unbroken line of popes dating back to the fishermen from Galilee. Jesus promised Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the power to bind and loose sins, establishing an authority that Catholics believe continues through each validly elected pontiff. But this divine institution operates through fallible human beings. As Catholics themselves acknowledge, the Church is both human and divine. guided by the Holy Spirit and perfect in her teachings, yet composed of humans who are imperfect. Throughout history, the chair of Peter has been occupied by saints and sinners, reformers and reactionaries, visionaries and caretakers. The conclave that will soon elect Francis's successor must discern which type of leadership the Church now needs. According to Catholic tradition, while God does not override the cardinal's free will during conclave, he does offer guidance to those who earnestly seek it. The process resembles selecting a spouse. There may not be one perfect choice, but once the selection is made, it becomes divinely ordained, and the faithful are called to support the new pope. Even if cardinals make a suboptimal choice, Catholics believe God will ultimately bring good out of it. For believers and skeptics alike, the conclave represents a fascinating intersection of the spiritual and political. The cardinals will weigh theological considerations alongside practical ones. Does the Church need a young pope with energy for long-term reforms, or an older transitional figure? Someone from Europe to reclaim the Church's historical center, or another from the global South where Catholicism is growing fastest? A theological heavyweight to clarify doctrine, or a pastoral figure to heal divisions? A skilled administrator to manage the curia, or a charismatic communicator to evangelize in a secular age? The decision will be shaped not just by prayer, but by alliances, factions, and competing visions. While Francis appointed about 2/3 of the current cardinal electors, this doesn't guarantee his successor will continue his priorities. Many cardinals from the global South, though appointed by Francis, hold traditional views on sexuality and marriage. Meanwhile, some European cardinals who seemed conservative have embraced Francis's emphasis on environmental stewardship and economic justice. Whatever the outcome, the new pope will inherit a church facing unprecedented challenges. In Europe and North America, mass attendance has plummeted, vocations to the priesthood have collapsed, and once Catholic countries have legalized practices the Church opposes, from abortion and same-sex marriage to euthanasia. Financial settlements from sexual abuse lawsuits have bankrupted numerous dioceses. Young people increasingly identify as spiritual but not religious, rejecting institutional religion altogether. Yet in Africa and parts of Asia, Catholicism continues to grow rapidly, often with more traditional expressions of the faith. In Latin America, Pentecostal and evangelical movements have made significant inroads into formerly Catholic populations. The global nature of these trends means no single strategy can address all regions simultaneously. The geographical and theological diversity of today's church was reflected in Francis's final actions. Though struggling with serious health issues, he traveled to East Timor in September 2024, celebrating Mass for 600,000 people in the world's most Catholic nation. He maintained communication with the Holy Family Parish in Gaza throughout Israel's military operations there, and in his last public appearance on Easter, he called once more for peace in the world's conflict zones, lamenting the treatment of migrants and opposing rearmament. Francis's social media account shared a final message hours before his death: Christ is risen. In this announcement is contained the entire meaning of our existence, which is not made for death, but for life. These words take on profound significance, as both his farewell and his testimony to the resurrection faith at the heart of Christianity. Now, with Francis gone, speculation inevitably turns to prophecies about the papacy's future. The most famous comes from Saint Malachy, a 12th century Irish bishop who allegedly received a vision listing all future popes until the end of time. According to this prophecy, which many scholars consider a 16th century forgery, Francis would be the penultimate pope before the last pope, Peter the Roman, during whose reign Rome would be destroyed and Christ would return to judge humanity. Such apocalyptic speculation has surrounded papal transitions for centuries. The Book of Revelation describes a false prophet who will work with the Antichrist, performing signs and wonders to deceive people. Some fringe interpretations have linked this figure to the papacy, noting Revelation's reference to the city on 7 hills, Rome, and claiming the Vatican fits the description of the wealthy, corrupted religious authority described in prophetic literature. But mainstream Catholics reject such interpretations, seeing in them centuries-old anti-Catholic polemics rather than legitimate biblical exegesis. They point out that the papacy has weathered countless crises over 2 millennia, from Roman persecution to medieval corruption, from the Protestant Reformation to the challenges of modernity. Through it all, Catholics believe the promise to Peter has held. The gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. What remains undeniable is that the Church stands at a critical juncture. The next pope must decide whether to continue Francis's reforms or chart a different course. He must address not only the sexual abuse crisis, but also financial transparency, the role of women in church leadership, relationships with other Christian denominations and faith traditions, and engagement with secular society on issues from climate change to artificial intelligence. Most consequentially, he must determine how to lead a global institution where regional churches increasingly face divergent challenges. Should he permit greater decentralization, allowing national bishops' conferences more autonomy to address local concerns? Or should he reassert centralized authority to maintain doctrinal unity? Francis initiated a synodal process aimed at more collaborative governance, but its implementation remains incomplete and contested. As these questions loom, the practical machinery of papal transition proceeds according to ancient protocols. In the coming days, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, as Dean of the College of Cardinals, will convene his colleagues. All cardinals under 80 years old, the cardinal electors, must travel to Rome for the conclave, while those over 80 may participate in preliminary discussions but cannot vote. These preliminary meetings, called general congregations, will begin around April 23rd. Cardinals will discuss the state of the Church, allowing potential papal candidates to emerge through their contributions. Between 15 and 20 days after Francis's death, the conclave itself will begin with a special mass. The cardinals will then process into the Sistine Chapel, swearing oaths of secrecy before the doors are locked. Voting follows a precise ritual. Each cardinal writes his choice on a ballot, approaches the altar, places the folded ballot on a plate, then tips it into a chalice. Scrutineers count the votes aloud, pierce each ballot with a needle through the word "elego," I elect, and thread them together. If no candidate receives the required 2/3 majority, another round follows. Up to 4 ballots may be cast daily. After each inconclusive session, the ballots are burned with chemical additives producing black smoke visible from St. Peter's Square. When a pope is elected, white smoke signals the decision. The newly elected pontiff is asked, "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" Upon acceptance, he chooses his papal name. The senior cardinal deacon then appears on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to announce, "Habemus Papam," we have a pope. The new pontiff then appears to give his first blessing to the city and the world. From that moment, he assumes full authority over the Catholic Church, with no higher earthly power able to overrule him. This absolute monarchy, the last in Europe with real governing power, stands in stark contrast to contemporary democratic norms, yet Catholics see in it a divinely established order dating back to Christ himself. Whether viewed as divinely guided or merely political, the conclave represents a fascinating intersection of ancient tradition and contemporary concerns. The cardinals gathering in Rome bring perspectives shaped by their diverse cultural backgrounds and ministerial experiences. The African cardinals, who have witnessed explosive church growth alongside interreligious tensions. The Latin Americans, who have worked among extreme poverty and environmental degradation. The Europeans managing institutional decline and secularization. The Asians navigating Catholic identity in predominantly non-Christian societies, all bring unique insights to this global decision. They also bring human ambition, prejudice, and self-interest. Church history records conclaves influenced by bribes, threats, political interference, and factional scheming. While modern conclaves operate with greater integrity, human dynamics inevitably influence the outcome. Cardinals form alliances, promote candidates from their regions or theological perspectives, and consider how a particular pope might advance their personal influence. For Catholics, the challenge lies in reconciling this human dimension with their belief in divine guidance. They distinguish between the office, which they consider divinely established, and the office holder, who remains fallible. The doctrine of papal infallibility, often misunderstood by non-Catholics, applies only to formal definitions of faith and morals, not to the Pope's personal opinions or administrative decisions. Most papal pronouncements, even significant ones, do not invoke this extraordinary authority. This distinction helps explain how Catholics maintain faith in the papacy despite historical scandals. The Renaissance popes who fathered children, the medieval popes who sold church offices, the modern popes who mishandled abuse cases, all remained valid popes in Catholic theology despite their personal failings. The Church survived their misdeeds, Catholics believe, because Christ promised Peter that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Yet this doctrine offers cold comfort to abuse victims whose suffering was compounded by institutional betrayal. For them, theological distinctions between the office and the office holder mean little when both collaborated in concealment. Beyond the theological implications, the practical consequences remain devastating. Lives derailed, faith destroyed, justice denied. These victims' testimonies reveal a pattern of institutional self-protection that crosses borders and spans decades. The specific cases we've explored, Father Revoir evading Canadian justice in France, Father Emmanuel transferred from Cameroon to Italy, priests from various countries reassigned to mission territories after allegations emerged, suggest not isolated incidents, but systematic policy. Father Stéphane Joulin, both a priest and therapist who works with abuse victims and perpetrators, described this practice as completely irresponsible, it's criminal, and noted the disturbing implication that if he goes to Africa or Latin America, it's not that serious, as if children there deserved less protection. This geographical solution prioritized the Church's reputation and the priest's rehabilitation over the safety of potential future victims. The Vatican's response to these revelations has evolved over time. Under John Paul II, abuse cases were often dismissed as anti-Catholic propaganda or the work of a few bad apples. Benedict XVI took stronger action, removing hundreds of priests from ministry, though the focus remained on individual perpetrators rather than systemic enablers. Francis went further, creating new procedures for investigating bishops who covered up abuse, removing the pontifical secret that had hindered information sharing with civil authorities and meeting personally with survivor groups. Yet critics argue that structural reform remains incomplete. The Vatican still maintains primary jurisdiction over abuse cases, processing them through canonical rather than civil procedures. Transparency requirements vary widely between countries, with some bishops' conferences establishing rigorous reporting protocols, while others maintain a culture of secrecy. And despite Francis's rhetoric of zero tolerance, activists point to cases where accused priests remained in ministry for years, while investigations proceeded at a glacial pace. Perhaps most troublingly, Francis's own response to abuse allegations during his time as Archbishop of Buenos Aires remains controversial. Despite claiming it never happened in my diocese, multiple victims came forward saying they had written to then-Cardinal Bergoglio about abuse and received no response. And the Grassi case, where Bergoglio allegedly commissioned a counter-inquiry to influence judges, raises disturbing questions about his commitment to justice for victims before ascending to the papacy. When confronted directly about these allegations during a public audience, Francis's response was brief and dismissive. Not at all. But the detailed testimony of judges, victims, and documentary evidence suggests a more complex reality. At minimum, it reveals how deeply ingrained the instinct for institutional self-protection had become, even among church leaders now celebrated for reform. This tension between institutional preservation and justice for victims manifests in other scandals as well. Financial improprieties at the Vatican Bank and questionable real estate investments using Peter's pence donations highlight the challenge of reforming entrenched power structures. Despite Francis's creation of new oversight bodies and financial regulations, resistance from within the Curia repeatedly hampered full transparency. Similarly, Francis's attempts to decentralize church governance met institutional roadblocks. His vision of a more synodal church, with greater input from laity and local episcopal conferences, threatened centralized Vatican power. Curial officials sometimes delayed implementing his directives or interpreted them narrowly to preserve their authority. The announcement of major reforms would be followed by years of bureaucratic maneuvering, often resulting in compromised implementation. These institutional dynamics will inevitably influence the upcoming conclave. Cardinals who have benefited from the current system may resist candidates promising disruptive change. Those who experienced frustration with Francis's management style may prefer someone with stronger administrative skills. And given the divisions his pontificate exposed, some may prioritize a unifying figure able to bridge progressive and traditional factions. The pageantry of a papal funeral masks these complex calculations. As Francis's body lies in state in St. Peter's Basilica, thousands will file past to pay their respects. Political leaders and religious representatives from around the world will attend the funeral mass. The ceremony will follow the simplified ritual Francis requested, dignified but modest, befitting his lifelong rejection of pomp. The burial will mark the formal beginning of the sede vacante period, the vacant seat, when the governance of the Church temporarily passes to the College of Cardinals. Cardinal Farrell, as Camerlengo, will administer essential Vatican operations, but no major decisions can be made until a new pope is elected. The papal apartments remain sealed, the fisherman's ring has been scratched to prevent fraudulent documents, and the papal seal cannot be used. This interregnum creates a unique moment for reflection on both Francis's legacy and the Church's future direction. Historians will begin assessing his impact, journalists will speculate about successors, and ordinary Catholics will pray for divine guidance in the selection process. Some will hope for a pope who accelerates Francis's reforms, others for one who moderates them, still others for a complete reversal, of course. Francis himself seemed aware that his pontificate would be transitional rather than definitive. In 2014, on his flight back from South Korea, he mused about serving 2 or 3 years before heading to the House of the Father. A year later, he told journalist Silvia Poggioli, "My pontificate will be short, 4 or 5 years. I don't know, maybe 2 or 3. I feel that the Lord has placed me here for a short time, nothing more." Though he ultimately served 12 years. This awareness of mortality perhaps explained his urgency in pursuing reforms despite institutional resistance. Over those 12 years, Francis reshaped the Catholic Church's public witness in significant ways. He shifted focus from culture war issues like abortion and same-sex marriage toward environmental stewardship, economic justice, and welcome for migrants. He encouraged pastoral flexibility for Catholics in irregular situations like divorce and remarriage. He decentralized some Vatican functions while creating new structures for financial oversight and abuse prevention. Symbolically, his impact was even greater. He replaced the red shoes and ermine-trimmed capes of his predecessors with simple black shoes and plain white vestments. Yet Francis struggled to translate symbolic gestures into lasting institutional change. His reforms of the Roman Curia culminated in the 2022 Apostolic Constitution Praedicate Evangelium, reorganized Vatican departments, and theoretically opened leadership positions to laypeople. But in practice, clerics continued to dominate, and entrenched bureaucratic cultures proved resistant to transformation. Similarly, his efforts to make the Church more synodal, governed through broader consultation rather than top-down authority, met mixed results, with some bishops embracing collaborative approaches, while others maintained centralized control. On the core issue of clerical sexual abuse, Francis made significant procedural changes while stopping short of the systemic overhaul many survivors demanded. He created new canonical crimes related to abuse, established reporting requirements for clergy who became aware of allegations, and removed the pontifical secret that had hindered cooperation with civil authorities. Yet he resisted calls for mandatory reporting of all allegations to police, maintained the church's internal judicial processes as the primary venue for cases, and failed to establish uniform global standards for prevention and response. Financial reform faced similar limitations. Francis established new oversight bodies, brought in outside experts, and commissioned audits of Vatican finances. The Vatican Bank underwent significant reforms, closing thousands of suspicious accounts and implementing anti-money laundering protocols. Yet major scandals continued to emerge, including a controversial London real estate investment that lost hundreds of millions of euros from donations intended for papal charities. Attempts to centralize control of Vatican assets met fierce resistance from departments accustomed to financial autonomy. Perhaps most consequential were Francis's efforts to reshape the College of Cardinals that will now elect his successor. He appointed cardinals from previously overlooked regions, Tonga, Myanmar, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and from pastoral rather than administrative backgrounds. He reduced the proportion of Italian and curial cardinals while increasing representation from the global south. These appointments reflect his vision of a church that is truly global rather than Eurocentric, focused on pastoral needs rather than institutional maintenance. The geographic balance of the conclave has shifted accordingly. Under John Paul II, European cardinals constituted a clear majority of electors. Today, they represent less than half, with Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania gaining influence. This doesn't necessarily predict ideological direction. Many cardinals from the global south hold traditional views on sexual morality while embracing progressive positions on economic justice and environmental protection. As these cardinals gather to elect Francis's successor, they face a church at a crossroads. In Europe and North America, the institutional church continues to decline, parishes closing, seminaries emptying, cultural influence waning. Sexual abuse settlements have bankrupted dioceses, while secularization has emptied pews. This geographic divergence creates a dilemma. Should the next pope prioritize reclaiming lost ground in former Christian heartlands, or invest in regions of growth? Should he maintain unified global policies, or allow greater regional adaptation to local cultures and challenges? Should he emphasize doctrinal continuity to maintain Catholic identity, or encourage pastoral flexibility to reach those alienated by rigid rules? Beyond these strategic questions lie profound theological ones about the Church's essential mission in the modern world. Is it primarily a guardian of revealed truth, maintaining countercultural witness in an increasingly secular society? Or is it primarily a field hospital for the wounded, embracing all seekers regardless of their adherence to doctrinal norms? Should it focus on personal conversion and salvation, or on transforming social structures to promote justice and peace? These competing visions have coexisted throughout Christian history, but the balance between them shifts with each pontificate. For ordinary Catholics, these high-level deliberations may seem remote from their daily spiritual lives. Yet the direction set by the next pope will eventually affect parish practices, seminary formation, school curricula, and the Church's public advocacy. The consequences will ripple through Catholic hospitals, universities, charities, and media outlets worldwide. Non-Catholics, too, have a stake in this transition. The Catholic Church remains the world's largest non-governmental provider of healthcare and education. It operates over 5,500 hospitals, 18,000 clinics, 16,000 homes for the elderly and disabled, and 140,000 schools serving over 60 million students. Its charitable agencies respond to natural disasters, refugee crises, and endemic poverty across the globe. Its diplomatic corps maintains relations with 183 countries, often mediating conflicts and advocating for human rights. The moral direction set by the next pope will influence all these endeavors. Beyond institutional impact, the papacy shapes global discourse on fundamental questions of human dignity, economic justice, environmental stewardship, and peaceful coexistence. Even those who reject Catholic teaching may find themselves engaging with papal encyclicals on climate change, capitalism, migration, or technological ethics. The next pope will inherit Francis's expanded platform for moral leadership beyond the Catholic faithful. He will also inherit unresolved scandals. The sexual abuse crisis continues to unfold in countries where survivors are only recently finding their voices. Financial transparency remains a work in progress. Questions about Francis's own handling of abuse cases in Argentina await definitive answers. The diplomatic compromise with China regarding bishop appointments has drawn criticism from religious freedom advocates. Each of these challenges requires both moral clarity and practical wisdom. Above all, the next pope must address a crisis of credibility. For many, especially in Western countries, institutional religion seems increasingly irrelevant to modern life. Scientific advances, technological conveniences, consumer culture, and individualistic spirituality have replaced traditional religious practice and community. Young people in particular often see organized religion as judgmental, hypocritical, and out of touch with contemporary values. Yet paradoxically, hunger for meaning, community, and transcendence remains strong. The decline of institutional religion has not produced satisfied secular materialists, but rather spiritual seekers, cobbling together personalized beliefs and practices. The environmental movement, social justice activism, and even digital communities reflect yearning for purpose beyond individual consumption and achievement. The Catholic Church's challenge lies in connecting its ancient wisdom to these contemporary spiritual needs. Francis attempted this connection through his emphasis on mercy over judgment, encounter over doctrine, and inclusion over boundary maintenance. His approach resonated with many who felt alienated by the Church's focus on sexual rules and hierarchical authority. Yet others worried that he undermined clarity and compromised essential Catholic teachings. The cardinals electing his successor must discern whether to continue this approach or chart a different course. Whatever their decision, the Catholic understanding of papal authority means the faithful are called to accept the outcome as God's will. The doctrine of apostolic succession holds that Christ's promise to Peter extends to each validly elected successor. While Catholics distinguish between the office, divinely established, and the office holder, humanly fallible, they believe the Holy Spirit guides the Church through each pontificate, even those marked by human weakness. This theological understanding contrasts sharply with contemporary democratic expectations. The Pope is elected by a small group of appointed cardinals rather than the broader Catholic population. Once elected, he exercises supreme legislative, executive, and judicial power within the Church, with no separation of powers or checks and balances. He can revise the code of canon law, reorganize the Roman Curia, establish or suppress dioceses, appoint or remove bishops, and define Catholic teaching on faith and morals. Yet despite this absolute authority on paper, practical limitations constrain papal power. The Church's massive size and global reach create institutional inertia resistant to rapid change. Doctrinal development must maintain continuity with tradition, limiting dramatic reversals. Implementation of papal directives depends on thousands of bishops and hundreds of thousands of priests with varying degrees of enthusiasm for particular initiatives. And in democratic societies, Catholics may simply ignore teachings they find unconvincing. These practical limitations explain why Francis's papacy, despite its reformist rhetoric, achieved incremental rather than revolutionary change. The cardinals who elect his successor understand these constraints and will likely choose someone whose vision seems achievable within existing institutional frameworks rather than a radical who might provoke schism or paralysis. The most likely outcome is a pope who continues Francis's emphasis on mercy, the margins, and global outreach, while bringing in greater doctrinal clarity and administrative structure. The College of Cardinals, after all, was largely shaped by Francis himself. Most members reflect his pastoral sensibilities, even if they might lean toward different priorities or methods when it comes to governance and theology. As the white smoke eventually curls from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel, the world will look not only to who the next pope is, but how he steps into the role. His first gestures, his first words and his first priorities will be scrutinized. Will he echo Francis's tone of humility and inclusion, or will he shift focus to reassert doctrinal orthodoxy and institutional authority? These initial cues often foreshadow the trajectory of an entire pontificate. Yet while speculation and analysis swirl around the papal transition, the daily life of the Church remains steady and active. Across continents, parishes continue baptizing babies, feeding the poor, educating children, and caring for the sick. For the vast majority of Catholics, their experience of faith happens in local communities, not in press releases from Rome. Still, the Pope holds a singular power: the ability to articulate a moral vision that transcends borders, ideologies, and cultures. The Catholic Church is unique in offering a comprehensive ethical framework, one that spans from the dignity of life in the womb to the care of the dying, from personal virtue to global policy, from family dynamics to environmental justice. Francis embodied this universal message not just through papal documents, but through symbolic acts. Laudato Si', his encyclical on the environment, tied care for creation to social justice and economic reform. Fratelli Tutti urged unity in a divided world, critiquing nationalism and economic isolationism. His embrace of migrants, the disabled, and prisoners emphasized Catholicism's call to stand with the marginalized. Yet his papacy wasn't without contradictions. His vision of mercy often clashed with the Church's bureaucratic inertia. His pastoral flexibility frustrated those seeking doctrinal clarity, while his sometimes centralized governance undermined his calls for synodality and dialogue. Transparency was preached, yet Vatican secrecy persisted around abuse and finance. These tensions mirror broader struggles in Catholicism: how to balance universality with cultural particularity, tradition with adaptation, authority with listening. Francis tried to navigate these tensions through what he called a culture of encounter, placing relationships above ideology and mercy above rigidity. This approach appealed to many disillusioned by the Church's past focus on sexual morality and exclusion. He broadened the Church's moral voice by spotlighting global poverty, climate change, and systemic injustice. But this shift alienated some conservative Catholics who viewed his tone as an erosion of moral absolutes. The next pope will inherit both the fruits and unfinished work of this legacy. He'll take over a church that now speaks more clearly about social justice, but remains institutionally wounded. New structures, like the Dicastery for Integral Human Development and the World Day of the Poor, are in place. But so are ongoing challenges: a worsening clergy shortage, persistent polarization among believers, and unresolved questions about the role of women and lay people. The sexual abuse crisis looms especially large. Francis began a much-needed reckoning, diagnosing problems like clericalism, secrecy, and careerism. But the implementation of reforms remains incomplete. The next pontiff must show the world, through transparent action, not just rhetoric, that the Church has learned from its failures and is committed to protecting the vulnerable. Beyond institutional reform, a deeper question awaits. What kind of church will this next pope lead? One that stands apart from the world, defending tradition against modernity? Or one that engages culture, finds truth in its movements, and adapts without compromising core values? One focused inward on strengthening Catholic identity? Or one reaching outward to the nones, the spiritual but not religious, and the marginalized? These questions are not new. They trace back to early Church tensions between prophetic challenge and cultural relevance. The cardinals in the Sistine Chapel will be weighing not only personalities but paths forward. Which kind of leadership will best serve the Church's global mission in an age of fragmentation, populism, and secularization? And they'll be doing so in a broader religious context. Around the world, institutional religion is retreating in the West, but expanding in the global South. Fundamentalism and religious nationalism are rising. Meanwhile, millions are embracing personalized spirituality, untethered from doctrine or community. The Catholic Church stands at the intersection of these shifts, global in scope, yet rooted in centuries-old teachings. Its centralized leadership creates both opportunities and obstacles, Unlike more flexible denominations, Catholicism can't pivot quickly, but its unified voice gives it unparalleled capacity to act on global challenges like climate change, migration, and poverty, if the next pope chooses to harness it. The task ahead is monumental, maintaining unity without uniformity, blending tradition with relevance, and renewing trust in an institution whose credibility has been badly shaken. Whatever the outcome of this conclave, one truth remains. The Church's witness depends less on any one pope than on how ordinary Catholics live their faith in everyday life. As Francis takes his final rest, his secrets buried, his legacy unfolding, the essential question isn't who wears the white cassock next, but how 1.4 billion Catholics will embody the gospel moving forward. In parishes and prisons, clinics and classrooms, soup kitchens and street corners, that's where the Church's future will be written. If this exploration of Pope Francis's legacy and the path ahead for the Catholic Church spoke to you, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll be unpacking every twist of the upcoming papal conclave, analyzing how it will shape not just religion, but global ethics, politics, and power. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. And let's hear from you in the comments. What kind of leader do you think the Church needs now? What lessons from Francis's papacy should carry forward, and which should be left behind? Join the conversation below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.